Chapter 1. A Morning for Dusting. The morning in St. Mildred's Lane began in its usual way. A weak sun pushing through the lace curtains, the quiet chime of the church clock, and the rustle of post arriving in neat piles on doormats. It was the sort of morning where one might take a little extra pride in polishing the brass, sweeping the front step, or dusting the mantelpiece. Small, contented rituals that kept the village ticking along in genteel order. Mrs. Albertine Greaves, however, was in rather a flurry. The Women's Guild meeting was to be held that afternoon in her drawing-room, and her standards were such that a stray cobweb could ruin an entire reputation. She moved briskly between the tall windows, the dust cloth in her hand, muttering about the shame of smudged glass, when she noticed something peculiar. On the walnut writing desk, an heirloom of her late father's, there was dust. Not an unusual occurrence, except that the thin grey film bore two distinct ovals, as though someone had recently placed their fingertips there. That in itself might not have been remarkable. What troubled her was that the surrounding surface gleamed. She had dusted it only yesterday. And yet the prints were not dulled by time, they were fresh. By 3:30, the village's most respected ladies were gathered in that very room, teacups rattling gently against saucers as Albertine poured. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the corner table where the hydrangeas sagged politely in their vase, listened with her usual calm interest to the chatter. It was all about the weather, the price of eggs, and Mrs. Fanshaw's new gardener, until the conversation shifted. Someone mentioned a frightful disturbance at the old Partridge house. The words hung for a moment. Inviting questions. It was Mrs. Harcourt who obliged. "They found poor Mr. Felix Partridge in his study this morning," she said in the hushed but eager tone of one bringing news of both tragedy and delicious scandal. "Dead, they say. Sudden, though no one seems to agree how. Inspector Walsh is already calling it heart failure." There was the customary chorus of, "Oh, how dreadful," and "poor man," before Mrs. Harcourt's eyes brightened just slightly. "But," she added, "I was told by the maid that the desk in that study had been disturbed. You know how particular Mr. Partridge was about his papers? Everything always dusted and in its place. And yet, someone had been there. Just recently, too." Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, her expression one of mild concern, though her eyes had taken on that soft gleam of someone quietly matching a new piece to an old puzzle. She thought, without saying it aloud, that fresh dust was a curious thing indeed, especially when it appeared where it oughtn't, and especially when paired with a death that seemed too quickly explained. The meeting went on, but the mood had shifted. Bits of speculation floated through the room like motes in the sunlight, motives guessed at, whispered connections made. Yet it was the detail of the disturbed dust that stayed with Miss Marple, as persistent as a clock that ticks too loudly in a quiet house. That evening, as the lamps lit and the wind rose faintly over the hedgerows, Miss Marple sat by her own fireside, knitting set aside. In her mind, she walked once more into that drawing-room, saw the polished desk, the two fresh ovals in the dust, and the name Felix Partridge lying quietly beside them. Yes, she thought. There was something in that dust that was far too fresh for comfort. If you like, I can continue with Section 2, where the village gossip intensifies and the first suspect emerges. Chapter 2. Whispers in St. Mildred's Lane. The news of Felix Partridge's sudden death moved through St. Mildred's Lane with the quiet swiftness of a winter draught that seeps under doors. By the following morning, every tradesman, shopkeeper, and postmistress had their own version of events, each embroidered with the subtle embellishments that village gossip wears so well. At the grocer's, it was whispered that Mr. Partridge had been found slumped at his desk with a glass of brandy in hand, suggesting perhaps a final, indulgent evening gone awry. At the post office, Mrs. Beckett, who claimed her cousin's neighbor knew the Partridge maid, insisted there had been signs of disorder in the study, papers disturbed, drawers not quite shut. And by the time the tale reached the bakery, it had grown to include a mysterious visitor seen loitering in the lane the previous afternoon. Miss Marple heard fragments of these retellings as she went about her errands. She never sought gossip. It had a way of finding her, drifting into her hearing as naturally as birdsong. At Mrs. Greaves's request, she had called that morning to return a borrowed sewing pattern, and had found the woman standing in her doorway with an air of brisk importance. "It's a dreadful business, Jane," she said without preamble, ushering Miss Marple inside. "Felix Partridge was as hearty as you please not a week ago. Heart failure, they say. Inspector Walsh seems quite settled on it. But between ourselves, I can't help wondering." Miss Marple sipped the tea she was offered, her eyes quietly on the pattern of steam. "Oh," she murmured, in a tone that invited confidences without seeming to press for them. "Well," Mrs. Greaves leaned forward, "there's that business with the desk. I told you about the dust, didn't I? The maid, Hester, said the police didn't think much of it, but I've kept a house long enough to know when something's been moved, and Felix never allowed anyone in that study except himself. You could eat your supper off the floor, it was so spotless." Miss Marple nodded gently, the movement barely perceptible. She let the conversation drift to more harmless topics, but the image of the two fresh ovals in the dust remained at the edge of her thoughts, like an unanswered question in a book. Outside, in the pale sunlight of late morning, the village wore its usual face. Yet beneath the surface, a current of speculation rippled. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Harcourt and Mrs. Lacey stood among the baskets of apples and early cabbages, their heads inclined together in close conference. "They say Felix was to meet someone that evening," Mrs. Harcourt whispered. "A visitor from out of town, no one's quite sure who." "Oh, I heard differently," Mrs. Lacey replied, her voice equally low. "He'd been rowing with his niece, over money, you know. Young people never understand the value of thrift. Perhaps it was too much for him, though, between you and me, I've always thought a quarrel takes two." The bell above the shop door chimed, and in walked Inspector Walsh himself, stout in his overcoat and looking rather harried. He offered the ladies a polite nod but did not linger, purchasing a paper bag of potatoes before striding out again. As soon as the door shut, Mrs. Harcourt exhaled meaningfully. He's wasting his time, looking for something that isn't there. Heart failure, indeed. Miss Marple, who had been selecting a small cauliflower near the back, let her gaze follow the inspector's retreating form. Walsh was a capable man in his way, but she had long observed that a firm initial conclusion was a difficult thing to dislodge. If he had decided upon heart failure, it would take more than a whisper about a disturbed desk to change his mind. That afternoon brought a fresh twist to the village's murmurs. Word spread that young Eleanor Partridge, the deceased's niece, had returned unexpectedly from Bath, where she was supposed to be staying with friends. She had been seen walking up the lane towards Partridge House, her face pale and her step hurried. Some claimed she carried a small suitcase. Others swore it was a satchel clutched close against her side. No one could agree on whether she had spoken to anyone, though Mrs. Greaves, from her parlour window, was certain she had seen the girl exchange a few words with Mr. Collins, the estate agent. By early evening, the matter of Eleanor's sudden appearance had become the main subject of speculation. There were those who thought she had come to settle her uncle's affairs, though others hinted she might be in some kind of trouble. "A girl doesn't leave her friends without a word unless there's a reason," Mrs. Harcourt remarked meaningfully over the counter at the butcher's. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat in her neat sitting room with her knitting. She was working a row of soft blue wool into a cardigan for her goddaughter's child, her fingers moving without hurry. In her mind, she traced the lines of the day's conversations, the freshness of the dust, the idea of a visitor, the niece's sudden return. None of these in themselves proved anything, but she had learned long ago that in a small village, seemingly minor details were often the truest indicators of human behavior. As twilight settled, a light mist began to creep along the hedgerows, softening the shapes of the cottages and dimming the lamps in their windows. At Partridge House, a figure could be seen moving behind the drawn curtains of the study. From the lane, it was impossible to tell whether it was Eleanor, the housekeeper, or someone else entirely. But those who passed that way later would remark on the faint glow that lingered long into the night, as though the occupant was searching for something or guarding it. The following morning, the atmosphere in the village seemed sharper, as though everyone were listening for the next piece of news. Miss Marple took her usual walk to the churchyard, where the frost still clung stubbornly to the grass. She paused, as she often did, by the newer graves, reading the names and dates, considering the brevity or length of a life. Death in a village was always a disruption, but sudden death, especially of one who had seemed in good health, was a disturbance to the natural order. It made people uneasy, prompting them to wonder what else might befall without warning. As she stood there, a shadow moved along the path. It was Mr. Collins, the estate agent, his hat pulled low against the cold. He greeted her politely, but there was a slight hesitation in his voice. "Sad business about Mr. Partridge," he said, glancing down at the nearest headstone rather than at her. "Never expected it. He'd only just been talking about putting the house on the market." "Oh," Miss Marple's tone was mild. "That is interesting. And yet I suppose such matters must be handled quickly when the time comes." He gave a brief nod, then excused himself, striding away with the air of a man who had said more than he intended. Miss Marple watched him go, her eyes thoughtful. If Felix Partridge had indeed been considering the sale of his house, there might have been others who stood to gain, or lose, from such a decision. And in her experience, changes to property were among the surest ways to stir both hope and resentment in a village. By the time she turned back towards the lane, the church clock was striking the hour, each note carrying on the cold air. Somewhere behind her, a door closed softly, though she saw no one on the path. And as she walked home, she could not shake the sense that the dust on that desk, and the reason it was so freshly disturbed, was a thread that, once pulled, might unravel far more than the manner of Felix Partridge's death. Chapter 3. The Inspector's Choice. By the third day after Felix Partridge's death, the village had settled into a pattern of hushed exchanges and sidelong glances, as though the air itself carried secrets too delicate to be spoken aloud. The frost had given way to a damp chill, and a thin drizzle kept most indoors, watching from their windows as the occasional figure hurried past. Miss Marple, however, took her usual stroll to the grocer's, noting with a practiced eye that the curtains at Partridge House remained drawn on the upper floor. There was something about a house in mourning that spoke volumes, not just in its silence, but in the choices its occupants made to be seen or unseen. She passed Mrs. Harcourt in the lane, who clutched her basket with an air of barely restrained excitement. "They've brought in Eleanor for questioning," she said without greeting, her words tumbling out. "Inspector Walsh himself came for her this morning. They say she was seen going through her uncle's desk the very night before he died, and—" Here Mrs. Harcourt lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some of his papers are missing." Miss Marple inclined her head gently, as though the matter were of interest but not surprise. In truth, she had expected that the niece's sudden return would attract the inspector's attention. The freshness of the dust, the whispers of a quarrel, the satchel clutched so tightly it was enough to tempt any investigator to see guilt where perhaps only urgency lay. At the station, Inspector Walsh was already satisfied that he had his likely suspect. "These young people," he told Sergeant Briggs as they stood over a pot of strong tea, "think they can hide behind their grief. But I've seen it before. Money troubles, a family dispute, and suddenly an ailing uncle dies in his sleep. Too neat by half." Briggs, who was young and eager to please, nodded in agreement, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. He had grown up in the village and knew Eleanor Partridge as a quiet, self-possessed girl, not prone to rashness. Still, a nod cost nothing, and it kept the inspector content. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple happened upon Briggs outside the post office. She inquired after his mother's health, listened to his polite reply, and then, as if idly, remarked, "I imagine it must be difficult, Sergeant, deciding what matters most in a case, the first story one hears, or the one that comes out after a little thought." Briggs gave a small, uncomfortable smile, aware that she was, in her gentle way, reminding him that first impressions could be misleading. Meanwhile, Eleanor herself was being escorted back to Partridge House by the inspector. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a line that spoke of exhaustion rather than defiance. Mrs. Greaves, from her vantage point behind her parlor curtains, noted how the girl carried no bag this time, and how her step quickened as she neared the door. "Mark my words," she muttered to herself. "There's more to it than meets the eye." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Eleanor, her coat still damp from the rain, stood hesitantly on the threshold. "I didn't know who else to talk to," she began, her voice low. They think I had something to do with it." Miss Marple ushered her in, guiding her to the fireside with the quiet assurance of one accustomed to hearing difficult truths. Eleanor explained that she had indeed gone through her uncle's desk, but only to retrieve a letter he had promised her, one that concerned her late father's share in a small piece of property. "It wasn't about money, at least not in the way they think," she insisted. "It was about keeping a promise. He said it was important that I have it, but when I looked for it, it was gone." Miss Marple listened without interrupting, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She knew better than to fill the pauses. People revealed more when allowed to measure their own words. When Eleanor left, looking a shade lighter for having spoken, Miss Marple remained by the fire, considering. The girl's account might have been rehearsed, but it might equally have been the plain truth, made awkward by the way grief muddles expression. The next day brought a development that seemed to confirm the inspector's choice of suspect. Mr. Collins, the estate agent, appeared at the station with a statement. Felix Partridge had been planning to sell a portion of his land, a transaction Eleanor had strongly opposed. If she feared the sale would go through, she might have had reason to stop it, by any means. The inspector, hearing this, was more convinced than ever. Yet Miss Marple noticed something in Collins' account that troubled her. He spoke freely of the land's value and the offers it might fetch, but when asked whether he had seen the paperwork himself, he hedged. "Mr. Partridge was a private man," he said. "He told me of his intentions, but we hadn't finalized the documents." To someone less attentive, it was a minor point. To Miss Marple, it was the sort of inconsistency that often hinted at a larger truth. By late afternoon, the drizzle had cleared, leaving the village washed pale and still. Miss Marple took a slow turn around the green, stopping to exchange pleasantries with Mrs. Lacey, who was sweeping her front step. Their conversation wandered to the matter of property sales, and Mrs. Lacey, without prompting, remarked, "Funny thing, that Partridge place. Always thought he'd leave it to Eleanor, but I suppose plans change." She went on to mention, almost as an afterthought, that she had seen Mr. Collins leaving the Partridge study one morning the week before the death, when Felix was supposedly away in Bath. "I thought it odd at the time," she said, "but perhaps I was mistaken." Miss Marple smiled her mild, unassuming smile, though inwardly she was turning the remark over with great care. Collins in the study when its owner was absent, dust on the desk disturbed before the death, and a sudden eagerness to suggest Eleanor's guilt. These pieces were beginning to edge towards one another, though the picture they formed was not yet clear. As she walked home in the fading light, she could hear the faint chime of the church bell marking the hour. Somewhere nearby, a window slammed and a figure moved quickly across the lane, vanishing into the shadowed path that led towards the Partridge grounds. Miss Marple paused, watching the place where they had disappeared, and thought, without certainty, that it was not the gait of a young woman at all, but of a man used to walking with purpose and without fear of being seen. She resumed her walk, her mind calm but intent. The inspector had chosen his suspect, but Miss Marple, with her years of observing human nature, knew that the truth often lingered in the quiet corners others overlooked. And in St. Mildred's Lane there were still many such corners left to search. Chapter 4. A small thing. Out-of-place morning came in a pale wash of light that left the hedges beaded and the lane smelling faintly of damp earth, and Miss Marple decided, with her usual quiet firmness, that condolences, properly paid, often yielded a truer picture of a household than any number of direct questions. She took a basket with a currant loaf. Sincere gestures make for open doors, and walked to Partridge House, her step unhurried, her mind returning to the purposeful figure she had seen slip into the shadows the evening before. The curtains were still drawn on the upper floor, but the study window had been opened a crack, a thin slash of air cutting the room's heavy stillness. She rang, and Hester, the maid, let her in with eyes reddened by sleeplessness, and a manner torn between grief and the awkward responsibilities of a servant suddenly made prominent. Miss Marple spoke softly, the way one does when the hushed quiet of a house feels like tissue paper over an open wound, and after a few murmured words she asked, only if Hester thought it no trouble, whether she might lay the loaf in the study, since Mr. Partridge had always liked a slice with mid-morning tea. Hester hesitated, then nodded, leading her along the corridor with a key produced from a small chintz purse. The study smelt of cooled ash and old leather. On the desk lay a neat arrangement of pens, a brass letter scale, and the blotter, all too meticulously aligned to be natural. It was a tidy that, to Miss Marple's eye, had been performed with the fastidiousness of someone trying to remap another person's order. A difference subtle to most, obvious to anyone who had ever tidied rooms that were not their own. She set the loaf down and drew a fingertip along the edge of the desk, not quite touching the surface, and asked, as if from innocent curiosity, what polish Hester used on the furniture. "The lavender beeswax, miss," Hester said, almost apologetic. "The same I've used these 3 years. Mr. Partridge liked the scent, said it lingered like a good sermon. Soft, but it stayed." Miss Marple's eyes warmed with approval, and she remarked that lavender did tend to settle into wood, whereas the sharper, orange-scented paste evaporated more quickly. The observation was casual, the way a woman might discuss recipes, yet she had noticed at once a faint, citrus-sour tang that had no business being in a room loyal to beeswax. Something quick and recent that had skimmed the surface rather than nourished the grain. She let her attention drift to the blotter, thick and well used, the upper page neatly turned but oddly free of the scrawls that accumulate during a busy day. There is a sort of honesty to papers that have been long touched. Edges soften, corners curl, and impressions, those ghostly shadows left by a heavy hand, accumulate like the palimpsest of a life. Miss Marple, who knew that a letter written in haste will emboss its urgency upon the page beneath, angled the blotter toward the window's slant of light. The faintest ridges appeared, as delicate as veins in a leaf, and there, half legible, she made out a handful of words. Option, 30 days, and a scrawl of initials that might have been an R and a C pressed down with decision. She did not linger. She set the blotter exactly as she had found it and commented instead on the admirable way Hester kept dust from settling on the difficult corners of the letter scale's base. Hester's gratitude, spilling into talk, supplied the sort of domestic detail Miss Marple treasured. The study, it seemed, had been locked the previous afternoon after Inspector Walsh finished with it, and the maid had not gone in since. She recalled, however, that the morning before Mr. Partridge's death she had done a proper, as she called it, lavender wax and a clean flannel, the sort of deep polish that sends a soft gleam rolling over wood in a way any owner would notice and be pleased with. Miss Marple asked, almost idly, whether anyone else had the habit of wiping the desk when Hester was not about. "Only Mr. Partridge himself, miss," the maid said, and then, after a pause, "Unless Mr. Collins. He's the estate gentleman, unless he did. He fussed a bit when he came that week, and I remember a smell that wasn't mine." That small confession, offered with the defensiveness of a careful servant unwilling to blame, nudged several thoughts closer together. Miss Marple did not leap to conclusions. She rarely leapt anywhere, but she permitted herself the smallest inward inclination. Lavender wax sustains its whisper for days, while the brisk orange paste flashes and fades, useful only to cloak a mark, a smear, an intrusion. A desk polished with beeswax 2 mornings earlier should not by rights carry a sharper scent today, unless someone, after Hester's careful work, had made an alteration and then hurried to erase the evidence with a different hand and different polish. She took her leave with gentle thanks, and, passing through the hall, paused before the visiting card tray. There were 3 cards. A vicar's, placed neatly, a dentist's advertisement no one had thought to toss, and one, face down. This last detail would have troubled no one who hadn't spent a lifetime noticing the modest habits of tidy people. Miss Marple turned it over with a gloved fingertip and found the embossed R. Collins in self-satisfied copper plate. The corner bore a pinch crease, the sort of half-moon mark people make when they pick up their own card from a dish to remind themselves of a date and then, thinking better of it, put it back again. She did not move it from where she had turned it. She let it settle face up as though the house, too, might like to know who had come calling. Outside, the damp air wove a chill through her sleeves, but she walked on, untroubled by it, to the High Street and the estate office where Mr. Collins kept his papers and his manor. He rose from behind his desk with the showy briskness of a man used to managing other people's affairs as if they were his own chessmen. On the window ledge, next to the property particulars of 3 farms and a cottage, stood an open tin of orange paste polish, the very brand whose citrus bite still hovered in memory over the Partridge study. Miss Marple admired the ledgers, their neat columns of figures, and observed, as though her mind ambled, that housekeeping in an office must be much like housekeeping anywhere. Dust in corners, fingerprints on brass. Collins laughed and said that he couldn't abide a smear, and to prove it he lifted the tin and, with his left hand, swept a cloth in long arcs that betrayed a practiced habit. The window wood shone briefly. The scent rose and fell. He talked, as people often do when they wish to appear transparent, about the unfortunate business of Mr. Partridge and the necessity, regrettable of course, of bringing order to any unsettled parcels. He spoke of Eleanor with the airy pity reserved for young women who are inconvenient to adult plans, and he shook his head at the foolishness of sentiment where land values were concerned. When Miss Marple admired the fountain pen on his blotter, he accepted the compliment with a flourish and signed his name, left-handed on a scrap where the ink splayed slightly at the tail of the C. She noticed the callus thickened along the side of his 3rd finger and the smudge of black at the base of his thumb, the natural badges of a hand that presses hard and leans into the stroke. Back at home, the rain threaded down again, making muted rivers on the window pane. Miss Marple laid her gloves on the radiator and sat with her knitting, though the needles moved only now and then, as if their clicking provided punctuation rather than pattern. She thought of the freshened desk at Partridge House, the ghost words pressed into the blotter, the lavender that should have lingered and did not, and the confident sweeps of a left hand in an office that smelt like the study ought not to have smelt. None of these, by themselves, made proof. Together, they made a tendency, and tendencies in the countryside are paths that, if followed, tend to arrive at doors. That evening, the village had the prickle of a place waiting for a verdict. Inspector Walsh, encouraged by Mr. Collins' account of the proposed sale and by the convenient picture of a niece in need, spoke more freely of an impending decision. People like a neat story. It makes them feel the world is obedient. Miss Marple watered her African violets and, tilting a leaf aside, considered how often obedience is merely fear wearing its Sunday best. She recalled Eleanor's face, not proud enough to be defiant, not soft enough to be easily swayed, and thought how the guilty and the innocent differ not in the volume of their tears, but in the shape of their silences. Before she went early to rest, she wrote a short note to Mrs. Greaves asking, in her most domestic hand, whether she might borrow the household account book Hester kept for the partridge supplies. The wax, the coal, the small items servants order without thinking, and mistresses approve without reading. It is in the humble ledgers of beeswax and lamp oil that one finds the dates polished into habit, and when a habit is interrupted, the broken cadence can be heard by anyone who has learned to listen. She sealed the note and set it by the door, satisfied with the mildness of her request. People yield to mildness when a demand would only tighten them. As the church bell tolled the hour, a figure stood for some time at the corner by the hedge, gazing toward Miss Marple's cottage as if to assure himself the lamp had truly gone out. He was not a man built for skulking. The poise of the shoulders suggested authority, the turn of the head a dislike of being kept waiting. After a moment he moved on, his steps unhurried, his outline melting into the rain's hush. Miss Marple, who had learned long ago to sleep lightly in times of village unrest, kept her breath very even and her thoughts very clear. The smallest things are often the bravest. A note about beeswax, the decision to look twice at a blotter, the memory of a scent that didn't belong. When morning came again, the lane felt a fraction brighter, the way a room does after a window has been cracked to let out the stale air. Miss Marple collected Mrs. Greaves's reply, yes, of course. The book was at Hester's disposal, and she smiled at the blessing of a practical errand. Somewhere between the purchase of lavender wax and the appearance of orange paste lay a truth about who had touched Felix Partridge's world last and what they had hoped to conceal. And though Inspector Walsh had chosen his suspect, Miss Marple felt the pattern begin to tilt, very slightly, as a framed picture tilts when someone passes, carelessly, a little too close. She straightened her hat, fixed on her gentle, unthreatening smile, and set out to listen, properly listen, to the household that grief had made suddenly audible. Chapter 5. The Ledger's Quiet Voice. It was just past 9 when Miss Marple arrived at Partridge House with her note from Mrs. Greaves in hand. The rain had gone in the night, leaving the lane mottled with shallow puddles that caught the pale sun in their stillness. Hester answered the door quickly, as though she had been waiting for some interruption, and ushered Miss Marple inside with a subdued politeness. The household felt quieter than before, not the respectful quiet of mourning, but the uncertain stillness of people holding their breath, waiting for the next piece of news to arrive. "I've brought Mrs. Greaves's request," Miss Marple said, setting the folded paper on the hall table, "the household account book, if it's not too much trouble." Hester disappeared for a moment and returned with a stout, leather-bound ledger, the pages faintly rumpled from years of handling. Miss Marple carried it to the drawing-room where the light from the tall windows fell clear and even across the desk. She opened the book without ceremony, letting her eyes wander over the neat columns of purchases: coal, lamp oil, tea, flour, lavender beeswax. The entries for the past month ran with reassuring regularity until she reached a curious gap. 2 days before Felix Partridge's death, the beeswax order ceased. In its place, on a separate slip pasted at the bottom of the page, was an entry for orange furniture paste, 1 tin, Collins and Sons. The name was written in a hand that did not belong to Hester's neat slope, but in a heavier, more angular style. Miss Marple ran a fingertip lightly under the entry, her face placid, as if merely admiring the legibility. She asked, without looking up, Who had placed that particular order? Hester hesitated. It wasn't me, miss. Mr. Collins brought it himself that day. Said Mr. Partridge wanted to try something different for the desk. I thought it odd, but I didn't argue. She bit her lip, then added, The tin's not in the pantry now. I've looked. Miss Marple closed the book softly and smiled with approval, as though Hester's thoroughness had been exactly the right instinct. She asked if she might borrow the ledger overnight, to which Hester agreed readily, grateful, perhaps for the sense that someone else was keeping account of matters the inspector had dismissed as unimportant. On her way home, Miss Marple stopped in at the post office. Mrs. Beckett was sorting envelopes into pigeonholes with her usual briskness, but she slowed just enough to offer a tidbit. Inspector Walsh was in here yesterday, sending off some sort of statement, all but certain about the niece now. Poor girl, but there's nothing worse than family turning sour. She spoke with the authority of one who had seen many quarrels end badly, and Miss Marple made no effort to contradict her. In the village, contradiction only sent rumors burrowing deeper. Better to let them run their course while she traced the edges of the truth herself. That afternoon, Miss Marple sat at her small oak table, the ledger open beside a pot of tea. She read it as one might read a diary, attentively, aware that patterns lie as much in what is missing as in what is recorded. The deliveries came from a handful of suppliers, each noted in the same careful way, until Collins and Sons appeared. The company was known for handling property sales, not household goods, which made the order for furniture pace peculiar in itself. Moreover, the ledger showed no payment for the tin. That, to Miss Marple's mind, meant it had been brought unasked or offered freely for a reason unrelated to polishing wood. In the late afternoon, a knock at the door brought Eleanor Partridge herself, her cheeks flushed from the brisk wind. She stood uncertainly on the threshold, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. "I don't know why I came," she said in a rush, "except that they keep asking me the same questions, and it all sounds worse when I answer them." Miss Marple poured her tea and waited, letting the girl find her own pace. Eleanor spoke of her uncle's change in mood the week before his death, how he had been distracted, almost agitated, and once, while she was visiting, had locked the study door behind him when she came down for breakfast. She mentioned, too, that he had been expecting a visitor, someone he described only as a man who can arrange things quickly. She had assumed it was to do with the land he was thinking of selling, but after his death, no such visitor was mentioned in the inspector's reports. "Did you ever see him write anything in haste?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor frowned. "Yes. 2 nights before he died, I passed the study and heard the scratching of his pen. He stopped as soon as I knocked, and when I went in, he was folding something into an envelope." Her voice wavered. "I thought it was the letter for me, but I never found it." Miss Marple set down her cup. "I wonder," she said, as if speaking half to herself, "whether people realize how much a desk remembers, even after the hand that wrote has gone." Eleanor looked at her, puzzled, but the older woman only smiled and offered another slice of currant loaf. That evening, as the lamps glowed along the lane, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the estate office. The blinds were drawn, but a chink of light showed at the edge of one, and the faint scrape of wood against wood came on the still air. She paused by the hedge, noting the rhythm. Long, smooth passes, the sound of someone polishing, not because it needed doing, but because it was a habit. The next morning, she returned the ledger to Hester, who thanked her shyly. "I've been thinking about that tin," the maid said. "It's not here, but there's a mark on the shelf in the pantry where it sat. Just the right size. I only wish I'd kept it." Miss Marple reassured her, then made her way back to the high street, her mind turning over the oddity of a polish that was bought, used once, and then vanished. At the Green, she met Sergeant Briggs, who greeted her politely but with a trace of unease. "Inspector's set on Eleanor," he said. "Says the papers from the desk prove it, only I've never seen them myself." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "It is a difficult thing, Sergeant, to tell the difference between what one knows and what one believes." She left him with that, knowing it would trouble him in the quiet moments. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the distant toll of the church bell. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting on her lap, and thought of the ledger's quiet voice. Beeswax every fortnight without fail, until the rhythm broke and the scent of orange took its place. A habit interrupted is as revealing as a confession if one listens closely enough. She would have to tread lightly. Collins was not a man who liked to be examined, but the time was coming when a single gentle question might cause the right person to step, quite without intending to, into their own shadow. And in St. Mildred's Lane, shadows, once seen, have a way of staying in sight. Chapter 6. A test of politeness. The next morning brought a thin frost over the green, crisping the grass and whitening the low stone walls along St. Mildred's Lane. Miss Marple had been up early, her mind set on what she thought of as a small experiment. She believed in experiments, though hers rarely involved test tubes or scales. They required only careful observation and a situation arranged so naturally that the subject of it never knew they were taking part. Today's would concern Mr. Collins, and the particular way in which he handled an object that was not his. By mid-morning, she was at the vicarage, where Mrs. Weatherby was setting out the church's autumn fete committee notes on the long oak table. "You must help me with the table plan," Mrs. Weatherby said. "I've asked Mr. Collins to join us at 11. He's very efficient with these things." Miss Marple smiled her agreement, knowing well that an efficient man was often too certain of his own manner to see what others might notice. The committee assembled in the sunny front room, the scent of fresh coffee mingling with the faint polish on the table's surface. Miss Marple had brought with her a small silver-framed photograph, an image of her goddaughter's child, which she set deliberately at the table's end near the stack of seating charts. The frame bore a slight smudge on one side, which she had left untouched for the purpose. If Collins handled it, the smudge would vanish, and in its place might be the faint trace of orange-scented paste that had lodged, she suspected, in the skin of his working hand. Collins arrived precisely at the hour, all brisk steps and genial nods. He took the seat Miss Marple had, without seeming to, left vacant beside the frame. As the meeting wore on, his fingers drifted to it, idly, as though adjusting it for neatness, before returning to the pages before him. Miss Marple did not look at him, nor at the frame, until after the meeting ended. When she did, it was only with the most casual glance, the sort that would not be remarked. The smudge was gone, and beneath the curve of the silver edge lingered the unmistakable, faintly acrid note of orange. After the others had departed, she lingered to help Mrs. Weatherby gather the papers. "Such a pity about poor Mr. Partridge," she remarked mildly, "and with all that business about the land. Did Mr. Collins seem close to him?" Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips. "Close enough to call in and out of the house, but Felix was a private sort. Still, I did see Collins leaving there one afternoon not long before. He looked rather pleased with himself, I thought." Miss Marple walked home in the pale light, her mind settling further into its pattern. It was not proof. Proof was the inspector's concern, but it was confirmation of a sort, enough to tell her that her instincts about the desk and the polish were not wandering down a false lane. That afternoon she was visited by Sergeant Briggs, whose face carried the awkward air of a man asked to perform a task he was not wholly sure of. "Inspector Walsh wants to know if you've heard anything useful," he said, glancing down at his notebook. "Eleanor Partridge is to be charged formally by the week's end, unless something comes up." Miss Marple poured him tea and listened without interruption. She asked, in the gentlest tone, Whether the inspector had considered all who might have had access to the study in the days before Mr. Partridge's death. Briggs shifted in his seat. The inspector satisfied it was Eleanor. Motive, opportunity, all that. The rest, well, he says it's speculation. And yet, Miss Marple said, almost to herself, speculation is only the child of observation, and children often grow up to tell their parents the truth. She let the words hang there, knowing Briggs would carry them back, if not to the inspector, then in the quiet corners of his own mind. The next day, the village saw a sudden change in the weather. A low, restless wind that rattled shop signs and scattered leaves along the cobbles. Miss Marple chose that morning to call on Collins at his office, carrying a folded sheet of paper in her reticule. "I found something," she told him pleasantly, "and thought it might be of interest to you as it concerns property." She laid the paper on his desk, watching how his left hand flattened it before his eyes scanned the contents. It was, in truth, nothing more than a copied extract from an old parish notice about boundary lines. A harmless thing, but Collins' manner was not of a man regarding idle trivia. His eyes sharpened, his fingers pressed harder into the paper as if to stop it from revealing more than it did. "Where did you come across this?" he asked, his tone too casual. "Oh," Miss Marple said lightly. "In an old book of clippings Mr. Partridge kept. Funny what people save, isn't it? You wouldn't think to find it pressed between recipes and gardening notes." She let her gaze drift to the tin of polish still on his window-sill. "And funny, too, how certain scents linger where they've no business to." Colin's smile was brief, almost reflexive, before he folded the paper and returned it to her. "I can't see that it means much," he said. But Miss Marple had long since learned that denial spoken too quickly often meant quite a lot indeed. That evening, she found herself invited to tea at Mrs. Lacey's, who, between buttering scones, confided that she had once overheard Felix Partridge arguing with someone in the lane outside her gate. It was a man's voice, firm but not loud. Businesslike, you might say. Could have been Collins, I suppose, though I can't swear to it. Miss Marple listened, thanked her host, and walked home with the slow certainty that the threads were beginning to knot. She still needed something more, something that would make the picture complete. But she knew now where to look. The desk, the blotter, the polish, the letter that had vanished, all were pieces of a game Collins thought he was playing alone. And in the quiet heart of St. Mildred's Lane, Miss Marple was patient enough to wait for him to make his next move. Chapter 7. The Vanishing Letter. The next day broke with a pale, brittle sunlight, the sort that made every window pane gleam and every imperfection in the glass stand out. Miss Marple took her breakfast quietly, her mind lingering on Mrs. Lacey's remark about the voice in the lane. It was the kind of detail that, while insufficient to stand alone, lent a certain weight to the shape she had been forming in her thoughts. A man with business in his tone, speaking where he believed himself unheard, that was entirely in keeping with Mr. Collins. But still, it was not enough. Mid-morning brought Hester to Miss Marple's door, her bonnet slightly askew from the brisk walk. She held in her hand a thin, much-folded sheet of paper. "Miss," she began, her voice lowered, "I found this when I was airing the linen cupboard. It must have slipped behind the shelves." She handed it over, explaining that she thought it might be nothing, but the writing had made her pause. It was Felix Partridge's hand, neat but pressed hard into the paper. Miss Marple unfolded it with care. It was not a complete letter, but rather a draft or a discarded first attempt. The words that remained were tantalizing. "Agree to the option. 30 days. My niece must be informed." Followed by a broken line where the ink had trailed. At the bottom was the beginning of a signature, cut off as though the page had been torn. "This was in the cupboard?" Miss Marple asked, her tone mild. Hester nodded. "Folded up small, as if tucked away in a hurry. I've never seen Mr. Partridge store papers there, and—" She hesitated. "The day Mr. Collins came, he went upstairs for a few minutes while I was fetching tea. I heard the cupboard door open and close. I thought it strange at the time, but I didn't like to ask." Miss Marple thanked her and tucked the paper into her reticule. The linen cupboard was an odd place to hide a letter unless one meant to return for it later without attracting notice. And if Collins had indeed been in that room, it suggested he was looking for something. Perhaps the very letter Eleanor claimed her uncle had promised her. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the high street, her pace slow enough to greet those she passed. At the post office, Mrs. Beckett was in the midst of sorting parcels, but she paused to remark, "Mr. Collins has been in and out all day. Always in a hurry, never a smile for anyone. You'd think the man was carrying the fate of the empire on his shoulders." Miss Marple smiled faintly and bought a sheet of stamps she did not need, thinking of how a man who hurried so much could also find time to stop and tidy things that did not belong to him. It was a habit, his unmistakably, and habits, once recognized, became the keys to small locked doors in the truth. The wind picked up in the afternoon, scattering dry leaves along the lane. Miss Marple chose this weather to pay an unannounced call on Collins at his office. He was at his desk, the tin of orange polish still on the sill, its lid resting askew. She apologized for interrupting and mentioned that she had found a curious scrap among some of her old papers, a half-letter concerning a 30-day option. "I wondered if it might be something you could explain," she said, her tone light, almost apologetic. Collins' eyes flickered to the drawer on his right before returning to her. "Options are common enough in land sales," he said briskly. "Likely a draft that was never used. No mystery in it." Miss Marple nodded as though satisfied and left after a few pleasantries, but she had seen enough. The reflexive glance at the drawer was not the action of a man indifferent to a piece of paper. It was the movement of someone checking that what mattered to him was still where he had hidden it. That evening, over a simple supper, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to fall into their quiet pattern. The letter Hester had found was clearly part of the missing correspondence Eleanor had been expecting. Collins, in securing that letter, had removed not only a claim she might have had, but also an obstacle to whatever arrangement he had been pressing upon Mr. Partridge. The freshness of the dust, the changed polish, the vanishing letter, they formed a sequence too neat to be mere coincidence. The following morning she sought out Eleanor, finding her in the narrow garden at the back of Partridge House, pruning frost-bitten stems. She showed her the partial letter. The girl's face paled, and she caught her breath. "That's his writing, Uncle Felix's. I knew there had to be something." "Do you recall," Miss Marple asked gently, "if your uncle had agreed to anything without your knowledge?" Eleanor shook her head. "Only that he said nothing would be decided until I had seen the papers. That's why I went through his desk after he died. I thought perhaps he had left them for me somewhere." Miss Marple left her with a few quiet words of reassurance, but as she walked back along the lane, her mind was fixed on the fact that Collins had been the only one outside the household with both access and motive to remove that letter. She was not ready to confront him outright. Timing was everything in such matters, and a man like Collins would guard his composure fiercely, unless jolted by something unexpected. By late afternoon, the church bell rang across the village, marking the hour. Miss Marple, sitting in her parlour with the fire banked low, thought of the faint citrus scent still lingering in her memory from the desk, and how easily it had betrayed its source. Soon, she decided, she would arrange for Collins to find himself in a situation where the truth would cling to him in just such a way, visible to all, though he might not know it yet. And in the close-knit quiet of St. Mildred's Lane, such a moment, once set in motion, was impossible to hide. Chapter 8. A Conversation in the Cold. The following morning carried a raw edge in the air, the kind that made breath hang visibly in front of one's face. The frost had returned in a light, glittering dust over the roofs. and the hedgerows seemed to hold their silence a little longer than usual. Miss Marple had spent much of the night turning over the same thought. Collins would not have risked tampering with Felix Partridge's desk unless the gain was immediate and worth the danger. Whatever the 30-day option concerned, it was something he could not leave in writing for Eleanor or anyone to find. By 10:30, she had made her way to the green under the pretense of visiting the churchyard. She knew Collins often took a mid-morning walk to the post office, and sure enough, his brisk figure appeared along the lane, a dark overcoat buttoned high and a walking stick tucked under one arm. He greeted her with his usual practiced civility. "Mr. Collins," she said warmly, "I wonder if you might help me with a little confusion of mine. I've been reading an old notice about boundary lines, such fascinating things, don't you think? And it mentioned an option period. It reminded me of that half-letter I showed you." Collins's stride faltered only slightly before he smiled. "As I said before, Miss Marple, nothing unusual about that. The law's full of such dry technicalities." "Ah, but I have always thought," she replied, her tone light, "that the driest technicalities are often the ones worth the most to someone." She let the words float in the air between them, neither pressing nor retreating. Collins laughed politely, but there was a guardedness in his eyes now, as though he were weighing whether to step around her conversationally or to answer it head-on. They walked together as far as the post office, where Mrs. Beckett appeared behind the counter with a small stack of envelopes. "Your registered letter, Mr. Collins," she said. "Would you like to sign?" Collins produced his pen, left-handed as Miss Marple knew, and scrawled his name with that same pressure that left a deep imprint on the paper beneath. When he handed the pen back, she noticed the faint sheen of polish still clinging to his fingertips, invisible to anyone who hadn't been looking for it. Miss Marple lingered after he left, asking Mrs. Beckett, in her mildest tone, whether she knew where Collins was headed. "To the station," Mrs. Beckett replied promptly. "Said he's got business in the next town. Land papers, I expect." That confirmed something Miss Marple had suspected. Collins was in the process of securing whatever arrangement Felix Partridge had been negotiating, and he meant to do it quickly, before Eleanor or anyone could intervene. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a quiet call to Eleanor, finding her in the drawing-room with a small pile of envelopes on the table before her. "These were in my uncle's coat pocket," she explained. "The inspector said they were nothing to do with the case, but one of them has Collins' name on it." She handed it over. It was a simple receipt from Collins & Sons, dated 2 days before the death, for services rendered in preliminary arrangements. No specifics, but enough to show that dealings had already begun. Miss Marple examined it briefly and returned it. "It may seem small," she said, "but small things are often where people misstep. They forget that a receipt can be read more than one way." The next day brought wind and a spitting rain, but Miss Marple still ventured out to the vicarage, where Mrs. Weatherby was sorting through donations for the fete. Among the jumble of crockery and picture frames was a heavy brass letter scale, its base polished to a gleam. "Collins brought that in," Mrs. Weatherby remarked. "Said it came from Mr. Partridge's study and thought it might fetch £1 or 2 for the church." Miss Marple bent to examine it, recognizing it instantly from her earlier visit to the study. The lavender beeswax scent was gone. In its place was the citrus note she had come to associate with Collins' particular brand of polish. That, she thought, was telling. Either Collins had been helping tidy the study after the death, or he had removed the scale for some other reason, and the donation was a way of disposing of something he no longer wanted seen in situ. She accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Weatherby, all the while considering that Collins' mistakes were beginning to collect. Each was slight enough to be explained away. An innocent visit, a helpful tidying, a piece of furniture sent for charity. But together they formed the outline of deliberate interference. The missing letter was the center of it, the thing that connected his movements to the moment of Felix Partridge's death. By evening the rain had passed, leaving the streets damp and shining. Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting slowly, the brass scale fixed in her mind. She thought of how people leave traces without knowing. Polish on a desk, an entry in a ledger, a scent clinging to the skin. Collins had been too thorough in trying to control the physical evidence. In doing so, he had created patterns only someone attentive to small domestic rhythms would see. It was nearly bedtime when she heard footsteps pause outside her gate, followed by the faint creak of the latch. She stayed still, listening. The sound of the gate closing again was followed by retreating steps, measured and deliberate. She went to the window in time to see a figure vanish into the dimness at the end of the lane. Coat collar turned up, walking stick tucked close. Miss Marple drew the curtain, her expression calm. Collins was not a man to loiter without reason. If he was watching her, it meant he was beginning to suspect she had more than polite interest in the matter. That, she knew, could be as useful as any piece of paper. Suspicion made people act in ways they later regretted. And in the narrow lanes of the village, where every window was a pair of eyes, such actions never went wholly unseen. Chapter 9. The Sunday Call. Sunday came with a pale, wintry light that seemed to leach the color from the cottages and the hedgerows alike. The bells of St. Mildred's rang out over the lane, their notes soft and steady, as villagers made their way along the gravel paths to the morning service. Miss Marple was there early, taking her usual seat near the back, a position that allowed her to watch without drawing notice. Collins was present too, seated halfway up the aisle, his hat set neatly beside him, his coat folded with a precision that spoke of habit. Throughout the service, she saw him glance now and then toward the back doors, as though his mind were elsewhere. When the congregation filed out into the crisp air, Collins took a side path rather than lingering for tea at the parish hall. Miss Marple, knowing well the rhythm of his movements, let him go on ahead and followed at a measured distance. His destination was the high street, but he did not stop at his office. Instead, he turned sharply into the narrow lane leading to Partridge House. The front door opened after a short knock, and Hester admitted him. Miss Marple, passing on the opposite pavement, did not slow her step, but her eyes took in the drawn curtains and the faintest trace of a shadow moving in the study window. A Sunday call at a house in mourning was not unusual, but this visit had the purposeful brevity of a man collecting something rather than offering sympathy. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid her own visit to Partridge House under the pretense of returning a basket to Hester. She found the maid visibly unsettled. "Mr. Collins was here this morning," Hester confided. "Said he needed to check some papers the inspector had asked him about, but he was only in the study a few minutes. After he left, I noticed the blotter was turned the other way round." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Did you?" she murmured. She asked no more, but the image of that turned blotter sat in her thoughts like a weight on a delicate scale. People did not turn such things unless they wished to hide the impressions beneath. And if Collins had come back for that purpose, it meant the marks she had seen earlier, those faint words about the option, had been noticed and perhaps feared. Walking back through the lane, she considered the narrowing of the circle. Collins had been in the study before Felix Partridge's death. He had brought the orange polish, removed the letter scale, and now altered the blotter's position. All of these were acts of interference, timed with suspicious neatness around the day of the death. Yet the question remained. Had he merely taken advantage of events, or had he played a hand in causing them? That evening, she found Eleanor at the vicarage, speaking quietly with Mrs. Weatherby over tea. The girl's face was drawn, her eyes restless. "They've asked me again about the night before Uncle died," she said when Miss Marple approached. "I keep telling them I went straight to bed after supper. I didn't see anyone come or go. But I did hear footsteps outside much later. I thought it might be Uncle walking in the garden, but the next morning he was gone. Miss Marple asked, as if merely curious, whether she had heard a stick striking the gravel. Eleanor frowned, then nodded slowly. Yes, I think I did. Just once or twice, as though someone was trying not to make a sound. It was enough to deepen the line of thought Miss Marple had been following. Colin's walking stick with its brass ferrule would make precisely that sound if placed gently on the path rather than swung. A man in a hurry leaves a different noise behind him than a man trying not to be noticed. The following day, Miss Marple stopped at the grocer's, where Mrs. Harcourt was selecting carrots with the air of someone choosing confidences. "They say the inspector's more certain than ever," she whispered, "and that Eleanor's to be brought before the magistrate by Friday." She shook her head. "It's a pity, but I dare say the truth will come out eventually." Miss Marple, while paying for her tea and sugar, thought privately that the truth had a way of coming out sooner if someone gave it a nudge in the right direction. And Collins, by his very attempts at tidying away the evidence, had given her several threads to work with. The task now was to weave them into something visible to everyone, something that could not be brushed aside as speculation. That afternoon, she sat by her writing desk, turning over the small collection of items in her mind. The half-letter from the linen cupboard, the ledger with its sudden change from beeswax to orange paste, the donation of the letter scale, and now the altered blotter. Each was small enough to be dismissed on its own, but together they formed a quiet pattern that could not be accidental. The question was how to present them without Collins realizing, until it was too late, that they pointed squarely in his direction. Outside, the late sun was turning the lane to gold, the kind of light that made even the smallest details stand out in sharp relief. Miss Marple looked out through her lace curtains, watching the shadows lengthen, and thought of how people, like days, often revealed their character most clearly in their last moments. She had no doubt that Collins would soon have one of those moments, provided she chose her time with care. And in St. Mildred's Lane, where the walls had airs and the windows were always half open, a single moment was often all it took for the truth to find its voice. Chapter 10. The Truth in the Polishing. The next 2 days passed with the same quiet expectancy that falls over a village when something is about to break. Inspector Walsh, certain he had his culprit, was making arrangements to take Eleanor before the magistrate. Collins, meanwhile, moved about the high street with his usual brisk efficiency, though Miss Marple noticed he no longer lingered in conversation. He was a man waiting for the end of a matter he believed settled. On Wednesday morning, Miss Marple sent brief notes to Mrs. Weatherby, Hester, Sergeant Briggs, and, most deliberately, Mr. Collins himself, inviting them to join her for tea at 4 o'clock. Her parlour was tidy, the fire warm, and on the table beside the cups and currant loaf lay a small array of objects: the household ledger, the partial letter from the linen cupboard, and a silver-framed photograph whose side bore the faintest gleam of orange-scented polish. The guests arrived in a flutter of curiosity, Collins last, removing his hat and smiling with polite inquiry. Miss Marple poured tea, allowing small talk to settle the group, before she began in her mild, unhurried way. "It has been such a distressing time," she said, "and I've been troubled by the thought that perhaps some matters have been misunderstood. You see, there are small domestic rhythms in every household. How often a desk is polished, the scent of the wax, the placing of papers. They are like the ticking of a clock, so regular that one notices at once when the beat changes." She turned first to Hester. "You, my dear, have kept Mr. Partridge's desk with lavender beeswax for years. Yet the week of his death, a different polish appeared, orange-scented, bought and brought not by you, but by Mr. Collins." Collins gave a short laugh. "Surely there's nothing sinister in bringing a tin of polish, Miss Marple." "Oh, indeed not," she agreed pleasantly, "unless it is used, quite hurriedly, to disguise where the desk has been disturbed. Papers lifted, perhaps, or a letter removed." The difficulty with orange paste is that it leaves its mark on wood and, for some time, on the skin. I noticed it on your hand at Mrs. Weatherby's last week, after you had quite unconsciously removed a smudge from my photograph. The room was very still. Miss Marple continued, her voice as even as if she were discussing a recipe. That polish was on the letter scale from the study too, the one you so kindly donated to the fete. A curious decision, given that Mr. Partridge had been alive and well when last you saw him in that room. You had also, it seems, been in the linen cupboard, odd for a visitor, where a draft of a letter concerning a 30-day option was found. Eleanor was to be informed of that agreement, but without the letter, she could not know its terms. Collins shifted in his chair. This is all very circumstantial. Yes, Miss Marple agreed again. As most human observation is, but there is also the matter of the blotter. I'd seen the impressions it carried. Words about that same option, initials I suspect were yours. When you realized this, you returned on Sunday to turn the blotter, hiding the marks. Unfortunately for you, Hester noticed, and Eleanor recalls hearing your stick in the garden that night, the brass ferrule striking the gravel just once or twice, as though you did not wish to be heard. She paused only to pour herself a fresh cup. Mr. Partridge was not a well man, but his death was hastened. You went to secure the letter and the documents needed for your arrangement before he could change his mind or consult his niece. A quarrel, a moment of pressure, and a heart already strained was overcome. You left with the papers and tried to erase your presence from the scene. But scent and habit are stubborn things, Mr. Collins. They linger. Sergeant Briggs was staring at Collins now, and Mrs. Weatherby's knitting had stilled in her lap. Collins's smile had vanished, replaced by the tight, wary look of a man cornered in a room he thought familiar. Miss Marple set down her cup. I do not think you intended to kill him, only to hurry matters to your advantage, but the result was the same, and the attempt to cast suspicion on Eleanor was a very poor act indeed. I have no doubt the inspector will wish to see the documents in your right-hand desk drawer. For a moment, Collins seemed about to speak, then closed his mouth. Briggs rose quietly and moved to the door. I'll see to it, Miss Marple. When they were gone, Mrs. Weatherby exhaled as though she had been holding her breath. Eleanor, pale but steady, managed a whispered "thank you." Miss Marple only smiled her gentle, unassuming smile. Human nature, my dear, she said. One learns to listen for the small changes, the things that do not fit the pattern. They are almost always the beginning of the truth. Outside, the lane was touched with the first gold of the setting sun, and St. Mildred's returned to its familiar quiet. Yet there was a subtle shift in the air, as though a clock that had been running unevenly had found its proper beat once more, and Miss Marple, settling back into her chair, thought how very telling it was that even the brightest polish could not quite conceal the marks left behind.